Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and welcome, Al. Nice to have you with us.
Good to be back.
So we're going to talk today about dairy, beef, crossbred calf performance related to the transfer of passive immunity, also TPI. Before we get into our session, though, I want to invite our listeners to post any questions they have there in the chat or in their social media feed. So, Al, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you walk us through this research.
Well, there's a couple subject areas kind of melded together here. One is colostrum administration. And as probably most of us know, um, ruminants do not pass antibodies from the mother to the calf in utero. So as a result, ruminants have this ability to absorb antibody proteins from colostrum, usually within the first 24 hours of life. And after that, that shuts down. So colostrum administration is very important, and there are a number of different dimensions that we've talked about those before, so we won't go into that right now. Now, the other thing is dairy beef. Probably 8 to 10 years ago, this started developing with genomics and sex semen. There were a lot of heifers around, more than most dairy farms needed. And so they said, well, why don't we just take our bottom third of our cows, or maybe up to a half of the bottom of the herd, and breed them to beef bulls and have crossbred beef, or dairy beef. And so that has developed to the point where there's quite a bit of that going on. There's still a number of issues to sort out. And I find that Dr. Tara Felix at Penn State University has done some really good, interesting work in this area if you want to Google that and follow what she has found. But in this case, a study was done on a large calf ranch in California in which they looked at both of these dimensions. That is, how much protection did the calves get from colostrum administration? And then how did that relate to their performance on this calf ranch? So there was a single calf ranch in California Central Valley, but they pulled calves from 6 different herds, and the herd size ranged from about 1,000 to almost 5,000 cows. And they picked up the calves at right after birth up to about a day of age, pulled them in daily. They housed them into a California hutch system. If you've seen those, they're like sets of 2 calf hutches side by side made of wood. And then they have a space under roof for the calves. And then they have separate facilities for either a water bucket or a starter bucket, and then a central area where they feed them with bottles for the milk replacer. So all the male calves that were brought in, and we'll see the distribution in a minute, were castrated, and then all the calves were bottle fed 2 liters of milk replacer, which twice a day, which had 22% protein and 20% fat, and it also had a coccidiostat in it. And then they were fed that until day 55. At that time, they cut one of the milk twice daily milk replacer feeding programs out, and they only fed them once a day until they were fully weaned at about 61 days of age. And then they were kept in the hutches until day 85, when they were moved into groups at another facility. The calves were also offered free choice water and a starter in the 2 different buckets. The calf starter was about 16% protein, but it was really a texturized starter because it had steam flake corn of almost 50%. But they also added some alfalfa hay, about 5%, which really wasn't necessary because it was well texturized, but that happens. Then they took some blood samples at 24 hours of age when they arrived, and then also later as well. And then those analyses were done where they were looking at specifically the total serum protein, and the IG, that is the antibody proteins. These are two different measures. The total serum protein contains the antibody proteins, so it's more of a general analysis, but it's simple to do on a dairy farm, and so it's commonly used. The antibodies, IgG, is a specialized assay, so you have to take a sample and you have to put it into a laboratory procedure and so on, and it takes more time to get results back. So that's used more often for research purposes than on a practical basis. So let's look at table 1 now. We see the distribution. There were about 1,000 calves involved. About a half of them were female and half male. The average body weight was about 84 pounds, but look at the variation, 13.6, 13.0. So that tells you that there was quite a wide range, and you might expect that with crossbred calves, and the fact that half of them are males because they're going to weigh more than the females. So that's why you see that variation. The serum IgGs was 21.3 plus or minus 10. So that's a wide range as well. The 21.3 is above the threshold of about 20. And the serum total protein was 5.5 plus or minus 0.8. And that's above the 5 threshold, although some people now say it should be really 5.5. And then daily gains 1.22. That's not as high as you might like, where you like to see it maybe be more like 1.5 pounds, because then that would double their birth weight at the end of 2 months of age. And then the disease incidence. Diarrhea was 65%. So 2/3 of calves had some diarrhea. That's quite a bit, but not too unusual when you're bringing calves in and commingle them. And then the respiratory disease was a little bit over 50%. So there's a fair amount of disease in these calves. Now let's look at the next table. We're going to look at both total protein, total passive immunity, which is based on total protein, and serum Ig. So if you look at table 2, there are 4 different quadrants. And this is based on a group at the USDA headed by Lombard et al. In 2020, their recommendations. It's also based on looking at the last NOM study, which was in 2014. What were the quartiles? So if you look at Lombard et al., that's the latest recommendation. So for total protein, no, for IgG, that would be less than 10, or total protein less than 5.1. So 10% of the calves in this population had those lower levels, so they weren't very well protected. And then 20% had the poorer category, and you see the numbers there, 10 to 17 range and 5.1 to 5.7. And then the fair category, the target was 30%, and you see that the numbers are a bit below that. And then the excellent category would be 40%, and you see that there's a 35.5%. So if you look at the NOMS 2014 and then what was present in this trial, you see that for the lower category, the target is 10%. In NOMS, it was 12. In this study, is 14.5. So running more calves in that lower category than we'd like to see. In the poor category, you had 23.5% in this study, 26.8 versus 20. So it's a greater amount than that threshold. And then when you look at the fair category, it's 30%, the target, and the actuals were 25.7, 26.9. So they're a bit lower than we'd like to see. And then the excellent category, greater than 40%, you see that both the populations, the overall one in this study was about 35. So we're not very far off, but we don't have as many calves in the upper two quadrants as we like to see, because there's a few more in the lower quadrants. And part of that could be because a half of these calves were male, and sometimes on dairy farms, they don't give as good a colostrum administration to male calves because their priority, of course, is their female calves. So that could be a factor there. Now, if we look at the next table, table 3, we look at the number of calves in these categories based on the total passive immunity and IgG. So in the first category, poor category, 153 calves, which is 14.5%. In the fair category, 248, which is 23.5%. And then good category, you had 284, 26.9%. And the excellent, 35.1 or 370. Now, look at the disease incidence in those various categories, and you'll see a common pattern. As you go from the poor category, overall disease, 90.2, and you get to the better, fair, and good, and excellent, you see those numbers decrease, the disease incidence. Then if you look specifically at diarrhea, it goes from 72% down to about 60%. Remember, the overall average was right at 65%. And then respiratory, 74% down to 46. And then if you look at the mortality, it follows the same pattern. So the mortality is highest when they have poor levels of antibodies in their blood. And that probably goes back to colostrum administration, which was not directly measured in this study because they came from 6 dairy farms. So we see a clear picture, which is about what we'd expect to, that the better protection, antibody protection the calves have, the less likely or the lower level of disease problems they're going to have, primarily respiratory and diarrhea. So now let's look at the next table, table 4. We're looking at, again, the total protein index and the total passive level and total protein categories. The previous table was based on IgG only. That's a more specific thing. In this case, you can see that the total protein has similar categories, 32% in the lower part, 34% in the fair, good, and excellent. So it's showing less calves in the good and excellent category than we saw with the previous table with IgG. And then we look at the overall incidence of disease, run from about 90% down to a little less than 80%. But you see that linear decrease in disease, diarrhea, and respiratory as you have better category of total protein. Although in mortality, it's not quite as linear because the excellent category had 1.9%, but it doesn't take many calves, even out of 1,000, to throw that number off a little bit. So what we see is that, if anything, the IgG represents a little bit better the performance of the calves in terms of disease and mortality than the total protein in the blood. Now, if we look at the last figure, then that's the graphs. We see by these various categories on the left-hand side, section A, that's based on IgG by poor, fair, good, and excellent categories. And you see the average daily gain to the left. That's in terms of grams. So, not surprising, the poor IgG-based calves had the lowest daily gain, a bit under 1/2 kilogram, which is about a pound. And then as you go from from poor to fair, the daily gain increases, and to good increases more, and not much difference with the last two categories, good and excellent. But certainly the the bottom half don't do as well daily gain. That's based on IgG. Now, if we look at the section B for the graph, the pattern's not quite as clear. It shows that the poor category did have poor daily gain, 490 grams a day, but then it was the other three didn't differentiate that much. And that I think comes back again to that total protein is more of a general gross measure as opposed to IgG. But what we see then overall in this study is that the crossbred calves responded to whatever level of protection they had in the blood from antibody absorption from the colostrum administration.
Very good. So a reminder, if you have any questions for Dr. Kertz, to post those there in the chat. Now would be a great time to do that. You can also access his column there in the chat that is linked for you. It's also on feedstuffs.com, and you will be able to read it in the digital edition of Feedstuffs that comes out here this month. So, Dr. Kertz, as we always like to wrap up with, what's the bottom line in all of this?
Well, the bottom line is it shows the importance of colostrum administration and the protection they get from it. And that's true, if these calves are crossbred and half of them are male, they're going into eventually into feedlots. That's important for them to have a good start with colostrum administration. And right now, I don't know the exact numbers, but I remember hearing that young calves, crossbred calves that are going to be raised to go into the feedlot can be worth $700 a piece or so. That's a lot. And right now, there's kind of a shortage of dairy heifers. And I've seen where some of the markets for bred heifers can go as high as $3,000.
Oh my God.
So,
wow.
What this says is no matter what market your calves are going into, because the beef price is still very high. So if you got a calf going into the beef market and feedlots, it's worth a lot of money. If you got a calf that's going to be a heifer and a cow, it's worth even more money. So in either case, the best thing you can do is get them off to a really good start, and that's with colostrum administration. And I would broaden that to not only colostrum administration, but the environment that the cow is calving in. If it's dirty, the calf's more likely to pick up some bugs, and that the colostrum is clean and either pasteurized if it's going to be stored for a while, or treated well, and get the colostrum into them as soon as possible, usually within 4 to 6 hours, because after that, the ability to absorb antibody proteins really falls off and is pretty much gone by the end of 24 hours. So the amount that's fed and how soon it's fed and how clean it is critical for how well these calves are going to do.
Very important stuff there. Yeah, we're just coming back from NCBA, the cattle show in San Antonio. Lots of talk about the dairy beef crosses and what might be ahead and how to manage and how to feed, and very important sector. So thank you for your time today. We always appreciate your insight that you bring to us, Dr. Kertz.
Thank you.
And we appreciate all of you tuning in as well. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.